The night was unusually quiet. A thick fog curled through the dimly lit streets, swallowing the faint glow of streetlights. Officer Daniels took a slow sip of his now-cold coffee. His partner, Officer Reed, tapping lazily on the steering wheel as their patrol car idled near an empty intersection. Nothing about this shift felt different, just another uneventful night in a small town. But that was before they saw it. A cat. Not just any stray minding its own business, but a cat with purpose. A cat that wasn't wandering aimlessly like the rest. It darted across the road, pausing right in front of their car, staring straight at them. Its eyes, wide and glistening under the flickering streetlight, seemed to plead for something. For a second, neither officer spoke. Cats didn't usually stop police cars. Then, before they could react, the cat moved, slowly at first, then faster, glancing back every few steps as if urging them to follow. "You seeing this?" Reed muttered, his brows furrowing. Daniel set down his cup, curiosity replacing his exhaustion. "Yeah, I think it wants us to go somewhere." They exchanged a look, a silent agreement passing between them. This was weird, sure, but in their years on the force, they had learned to trust their instincts. And right now, something about this felt off. Without another word, Reed flicked on the headlights and eased the car forward, trailing behind the small creature as it wove its way through darkened streets. The cat led them out of town, away from the familiar, the comfortable. The road ahead was barely visible, the fog thickening like a living thing trying to keep them out. Daniels felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He had been on late-night calls before, disturbances, break-ins, even a missing person or two, but there was something unsettling about being led by an animal. Minutes passed. The cat never faltered, never hesitated. It knew exactly where it was going. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Right at the entrance of a wooded path, its tail flicking anxiously. The patrol car rolled to a slow halt. Neither officer moved. "This is odd," Reed said, his voice lower than before. Daniels exhaled sharply, his breath fogging up the window. Odd doesn't even begin to cover it. They stepped out of the car, boots crunching against the gravel. The cat sat still, watching them with those unblinking eyes, then let out a soft, almost sorrowful meow before darting into the darkness ahead. A glance passed between the officers once more before they switched on their flashlights and followed. The air grew colder as they moved deeper into the woods. The crunch of leaves beneath their feet was the only sound besides their own breaths. The deeper they went, the more an eerie feeling settled in, the kind that made your skin prickle, that sent a whisper of unease crawling down your spine. Then they saw it. Reed was the first to stop, his flashlight frozen on a shape up ahead. Daniels followed his gaze, and his stomach dropped. Something was there, just beyond the reach of their beams. Still, waiting, and then ever so slightly it moved. Daniels tightened his grip on the flashlight, his pulse quickening. The beam shook slightly as he lifted it higher, trying to get a better look. Whatever was in front of them was partially obscured by the trees, its shape barely distinguishable from the shadows. It wasn't moving now, but something about it felt wrong. Reed took a slow step forward. "You see that?" he whispered, barely audible. Daniels gave a stiff nod. "Yeah." The cat had stopped a few feet ahead, its ears flattened, tail twitching. It let out another low meow, this time sharper, urgent. It wasn't guiding them anymore. It was warning them. Reed exhaled, steadying himself. "We should call this in?" Daniels hesitated. Something about this didn't feel like something they could explain over the radio. "Let's check it out first," he murmured. Reed shot him a look, but nodded. Together, they inched forward, their boots careful against the damp earth. The smell hit them before anything else. A strange, metallic tang in the air, faint but unmistakable. Daniels felt his stomach twist. He had been around crime scenes before. He knew that scent. The flashlight beams finally landed on the shape ahead, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. A tattered piece of fabric clung to a low-hanging branch, its edges torn as if something, or someone, had passed through here in a hurry. Below it, the dirt looked disturbed, scattered with deep indentations. Daniels crouched, running his fingers lightly over the ground. Something heavy was dragged through here, he muttered. Recently, Reed scanned the area, his jaw tightening. And not just anything heavy, he said. Look at those tracks. Those aren't normal footprints. Daniels followed the light where Reed was pointing. The marks in the dirt were uneven, too deep in some places, like someone or something had stumbled through the area. But what made his blood run cold was the shape of them. They weren't normal shoe prints. They weren't even human. A sharp, rustling noise made them both jerk their heads up. The cat let out a low, guttural hiss. The sound was different this time, like pure fear. It backed away, for standing on end, eyes locked on something just beyond their sight. Daniel swallowed hard, his hand instinctively moving toward the holster at his hip. He didn't unclip it, at least not yet, but the weight of his weapon was suddenly reassuring. Reed took a cautious step toward the source of the noise. His flashlight flickered slightly, and for a moment he thought it was just his nerves. But then Daniel's light flickered too. The air felt heavy, charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm. "We're not alone," Reed murmured. Daniels didn't respond. He was too focused on the feeling creeping up his spine, the sensation of being watched. He had felt it before, on certain calls, in certain situations where things had gone bad fast. But this was different. This wasn't just someone hiding in the woods, waiting to jump them. This felt older. The cat suddenly bolted, disappearing into the trees. Daniels wanted to follow it, to trust that whatever instincts had driven it to seek them out were now telling it to run. But something kept him rooted to the spot. Another sound, a sharp crack, like a branch snapping under weight, echoed through the trees. Closer this time. Too close. Reed's breathing had slowed, his eyes scanning the darkness. Daniels. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I think we should go." Daniels wanted to agree. Every logical part of him was screaming to turn back, to get in the car and call for backup. But his gut told him that whatever was here, whatever had led them this far, wasn't done with them yet. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the woods fell silent again. No rustling, no distant animal sounds. Nothing. Just an eerie, unnatural stillness. The flashlight beams cut through the fog, but the deeper they searched, the less they could see. It was like the darkness itself was swallowing everything past a certain point. Then something moved, not in front of them, but above. Reed barely had time to react before the branches above them shifted. A blur of movement, something dropping low enough to stir the air before disappearing into the treetops again. Daniels jerked his light upward, but there was nothing. Just the swaying of leaves, like something had just been there a second ago. "What was that?" Reed hissed, stepping back instinctively. Daniels didn't answer. He couldn't, because deep down, he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Another sound, this time farther away. A low, distant hum. It didn't belong in the forest. It didn't belong anywhere. Reed shook his head, already moving back toward the car. "We need to leave. Now." Daniels hesitated 1 second longer, scanning the trees one last time. The tracks in the dirt. The strange marks. The way the cat had seemed to know something they didn't. He wasn't sure what was out here, but he was sure of one thing. They weren't supposed to find it. And now it knew they had. Daniels and Reed moved quickly, their steps careful but urgent as they made their way back toward the car. The cat was gone now, vanished into the thick undergrowth, and somehow, that made everything worse. The presence of the small creature had been the only thing grounding them, giving them some sense of direction in this eerie, unnatural silence. Now, without it, the woods felt even heavier, like something unseen was pressing in around them. Reed kept his flashlight pointed ahead, but his other hand hovered near his radio. He hadn't called for backup yet, maybe because he knew the moment he did, he'd have to explain what exactly they were dealing with. And right now, neither of them had a clue. Daniel's heartbeat thudded in his ears as they finally reached the patrol car. The air was still thick with fog, rolling over the empty road like slow-moving smoke. He placed a hand on the hood of the car, grounding himself for just a second. Everything in him was telling him to drive, to get out of there, but he wasn't sure if they should be running, or if leaving now would only make things worse. Reed climbed into the driver's seat, twisting the keys in the ignition. The engine gave a low whine before turning over, the headlights slicing through the mist in weak, hazy beams. Daniels opened the passenger door, but hesitated before getting in. He turned, scanning the tree line again. That feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. Then something changed. A flicker of movement, just at the edge of his vision. Not in the trees this time, but farther down the road. Something or someone was standing there. "Reed," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. Reed caught the urgency in his tone and turned his head sharply. He followed Daniel's gaze, his fingers tightening around the steering wheel. There, just beyond the reach of the headlights, was a figure, unmoving, watching. For a moment, neither officer spoke. The figure was tall, but obscured by the fog, its features impossible to make out. But there was something wrong with it. The way it stood, the way it didn't shift or breathe or react to the car's presence. Just staring. Then, as if sensing their attention, it took a step forward. Reed cursed under his breath. "Nope. Nope. We're not doing this." He reached for the radio, his fingers fumbling over the button. "Dispatch, this is Officer Reed, requesting immediate backup at." The radio cut to static. Reed frowned, adjusting the dial. "Come on, don't do this now." The static deepened, turning into something worse, a low, distorted noise, like something was pressing against the signal. Then, buried within the interference, a sound. A voice? No, not a voice. A whisper. Daniels could hear it too, though the words were impossible to make out. It wasn't human. It wasn't even a language he recognized. Just a series of sounds, shifting in and out, rising and falling like something was speaking from the other side of a broken transmission. Then, the radio went dead. Daniels turned back toward the road, but the figure was gone. Reed swore again, this time louder, and slammed the radio back into place. "That's it. We're leaving." Daniels didn't argue. He slid into the seat, pulling the door shut just as Reed hit the gas. The tires spun against the damp road before the car lurched forward, speeding away from the tree line. Daniels kept his eyes on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something chasing them, something running just beyond the glow of the taillights. But there was nothing, at least not at first. They had barely made it a mile down the road when the headlights flickered. A single, sharp stutter, then another. The entire electrical system gave a brief, shuddering pulse, like something was interfering with it. And then, without warning, the engine died. Reed slammed his foot against the pedal, turning the key furiously. Nothing. No response. Daniels reached for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Officer Daniels. We're experiencing static." A cold dread settled over them. Reed let out a shaking breath. "This isn't normal, man. This isn't some freak power failure. Something is messing with us." Daniels nodded, but his eyes were locked on the windshield. The fog was thicker now, curling against the glass like it had a life of its own. Shapes moved within it, not solid, not entirely there, but shifting in and out of existence like something was waiting just beyond their sight. Then, through the swirling mist, something pressed against the glass. A hand. Daniel's breath hitched. It was only there for a second, just long enough for him to register it before it vanished again. But he had seen it. A human hand, or something close to one. Reed was still twisting the key, frantically, his panic rising. Come on, come on." The engine roared to life. The headlights blazed back on. The fog recoiled, pulling away from the car as if retreating from the sudden burst of power. Neither of them hesitated. Reed hit the gas, and the car surged forward. The road ahead stretched into darkness, the town still miles away, but neither of them spoke. Because now they knew. They weren't just being watched. They were being followed. The road stretched ahead, swallowed by the thickening fog, but Reed didn't slow down. The patrol car's tires gripped the pavement with an uneasy hum, the engine growling as if it, too, was desperate to put distance between them and whatever they had left behind. Daniels kept his eyes on the side mirrors, his pulse hammering in his ears. He expected to see something lurking at the edges of the mist, waiting, watching. But the road behind them was empty. Still, the feeling of being followed hadn't gone away. If anything, it was worse. Reed exhaled sharply, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. This isn't happening. This isn't real. Daniels swallowed hard. He wanted to agree, to tell himself that the strange radio interference, the flickering lights, the shadowed figure, and the hand on the windshield were just tricks of the night. But he couldn't. He had seen too much, felt too much. This is real, he muttered. Reed shook his head, but didn't argue. He kept driving, his foot heavy on the gas. The town wasn't far now. They just had to make it back. Find answers. Find someone to tell them that they hadn't just seen what they thought they had. Then the car lurched. The sudden jolt sent them both forward, Reed barely managing to keep control of the wheel. It felt like they had hit something, but the road was empty. No potholes, no debris. Nothing. Daniel's heart pounded. What was that? Reed didn't answer. His eyes flicked to the dashboard, his breath hitching. The fuel gauge was dropping. Fast. Daniels watched in disbelief as the needle plunged lower and lower, despite the tank being more than half full just minutes ago. The engine sputtered, coughing like something was choking it from the inside. Reed cursed under his breath. No, this doesn't make sense. Then came the sound, a deep, guttural vibration, too low for human ears but felt in the chest. It rumbled through the car, through their bones, shaking the windows like a force pressing against them from all sides. Reed's grip on the wheel tightened. Where is that coming from? Daniel's hand instinctively went to his holster, even though he knew a weapon wouldn't help against whatever this was. He turned, scanning the road, the trees, the sky, anywhere the noise might be coming from. Then, out of the fog, shapes began to emerge. At first, they were just silhouettes, dark figures standing motionless along the sides of the road, their bodies barely distinguishable from the swirling mist. Dozens of them. Daniel's throat went dry. Reed, do not stop this car. Reed's breathing had turned shallow, his hands locked on the wheel. I wasn't planning on it. The figures stood still as they passed, but something about them was wrong. Their outlines shifted, blurred at the edges like they weren't fully formed. Some were too tall, others too thin, their proportions slightly off, as if they had been shaped into something human but had never quite gotten it right. Daniels forced himself to look straight ahead, but the weight of their presence pressed on him. He could feel their gazes, even though they had no faces. The road curved sharply, and Reed took it fast, tires screeching against the pavement. The town's lights were visible now, a faint, distant glow cutting through the darkness. They were close. Then the headlights flickered again. Reed gritted his teeth. Not now. Not now. Daniels checked the side mirror one last time, then froze. The figures weren't standing still anymore. They were moving, not walking, not running, just shifting like they were gliding through the fog, closing in from all sides. Daniels reached for the radio again, even though he knew it wouldn't work. He had to try. Dispatch, this is Officer Daniels. Do you copy? A crackle of static. Then, should not have followed. The voice wasn't human. It was layered, distorted like multiple voices speaking at once. Then, just as suddenly, the radio went silent again. Daniels turned to Reed. Drive faster. I'm already pushing it, Reed snapped. We just have to. The engine died. The car skidded, the power steering locking up as Reed fought to keep them on the road. They came to a jerking halt just feet from the town limits, the distant glow of streetlights barely visible through the fog. The silence was suffocating. Daniels and Reed sat frozen, neither daring to move. Then the lights outside flickered. The glow of the town, once warm, familiar, began to dim. Streetlights winked out one by one, as if the darkness itself was spreading. Reed let out a slow, shaky breath. Daniels didn't respond, because something was standing in the middle of the road. Closer now, waiting. Reed's hands tightened around the steering wheel, though the car was lifeless beneath his grip. The glow of the town had all but vanished, swallowed by the suffocating dark, leaving them stranded just feet from safety. But Daniels wasn't thinking about that anymore. He wasn't thinking about the car, the radio, or the figures in the fog. His focus was locked on the thing standing in the middle of the road. At first, it looked like a person, a tall figure still as stone, its head tilted slightly like it was watching them. But the longer Daniels looked, the less certain he was. The proportions were wrong. The limbs were too long, the shoulders unnaturally narrow. And its skin, if it even had skin, seemed to shift, its texture rippling like it wasn't solid, like it wasn't meant to be seen. Then it moved. Not a step, not a twitch. It just shifted. 1 second it was standing in the road, and the next it was closer. Too close. Daniels felt his breath catch. His mind screamed at him to react, to move, to do something, but his body refused. The air in the car had thickened, pressing down on them like they were sinking into something unseen. Reed's voice came out hoarse. "Tell me you saw that." Daniel swallowed, his throat dry. "I saw it." The figure shifted again. Closer. Reed fumbled for the keys, twisting them hard, but the engine didn't so much as click. "Come on, come on." The fog swirled tighter around them, closing off everything beyond the reach of the dimming headlights. The figures from before, the ones that had lined the road, were gone. But they weren't alone. Daniels could feel it. A presence. No, not just one. Many. He turned slowly, his pulse hammering in his ears. The windshield had started to fog up, but it wasn't from their breath. Something else was pressing against the glass. Something unseen, but heavy, like the air itself was thickening, warping under an invisible weight. Then, without warning, the radio crackled. A sharp burst of static, followed by a sound, low and distorted, like a voice stretched too thin. Reed flinched, his head snapping toward the speaker. Then came the whisper, not from the radio, from inside the car. Daniels felt his entire body go cold. The voice was soft, just inches away, threading through the air like it had been waiting. It didn't belong to either of them. "You shouldn't be here." Reed twisted so fast that his seat creaked, his eyes wild. "Daniels, tell me you heard that." Daniels couldn't speak. He could barely breathe. The whisper had been close, too close. Like someone had been right there between them, speaking into the stillness. Then the temperature dropped. It wasn't just cold. It was unnatural. A deep, bone-seeping chill that had nothing to do with the night air. The windows fogged over completely, obscuring the outside world. The headlights flickered again, once, twice, then shut off entirely, plunging them into darkness. Reed let out a sharp breath. "Nope, nope, we're not doing this." He yanked the door handle, pushing hard, but the door didn't budge. Daniels tried his own, but it was the same. Stuck, locked in place. Then the car moved. Not forward, not backward. Up. A sharp jolt rocked the vehicle, lifting it off its tires as if something unseen had wrapped around it. Daniel's stomach flipped as gravity seemed to shift, pressing him harder against his seat. Reed was cursing now, twisting in his seat, fighting against the locked doors. "This isn't real. This isn't real." Daniel's hand went to his belt, fumbling for his weapon, even though he had no idea what good it would do. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible. Then the car dropped. The impact was brutal. The tires slammed against the pavement, the force rattling through the frame with a sickening crunch. The windshield cracked, spiderwebbing out from an unseen pressure. And then silence. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The weight of what had just happened pressed against them, like an invisible hand, suffocating and thick. Then the headlights flickered back on. The figure in the road was gone, but something else was there now. Daniels turned slowly, his breath uneven. And that's when he saw them. Dozens of them. Figures standing in the road, in the trees, surrounding the car from every direction. No faces. No features. Just the unsettling shapes, shifting, watching. But it wasn't just them. Something was moving behind them. Something bigger. Something that had been waiting. Daniel's breathing was shallow. His hands clenched so tightly around his knees that his nails dug into his skin. The figures stood motionless, surrounding them from all sides, their forms barely distinguishable in the swirling fog. But it wasn't them that made his chest tighten with fear. It was whatever was behind them. Something massive shifted in the darkness, its presence suffocating, pressing against the air itself. It didn't move like the others. It wasn't just standing there. It was coming closer. Reed gripped the wheel like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. "Daniels," he said, his voice barely more than a breath. "We have to move." Daniels couldn't answer. His mind was screaming at him to react, to do something, but his body wouldn't listen. Every instinct told him that whatever was out there wasn't something they could fight, wasn't something they could even comprehend. Then the figures in the road did something new. They stepped back, not all at once, but in a slow, rippling motion, their shifting bodies parting, clearing the road ahead. It wasn't an act of retreat. It was something else. They were making way. Reed's grip on the wheel tightened. He didn't wait to question it. He turned the key. The engine roared to life. Daniels barely had time to register it before Reed slammed his foot on the gas. The tires screeched against the pavement, and the car lurched forward, cutting through the parting figures. Daniels didn't look back. He couldn't. The town's lights were suddenly visible again, distant but growing closer, a promise of safety, or at least of something real. The figures didn't follow. The fog thinned as they sped ahead, leaving the nightmare behind them. Neither of them spoke until they passed the first streetlight. Reed let out a sharp, shaky breath, his fingers trembling against the wheel. Tell me that just happened. Tell me I'm not losing my mind. Daniel swallowed, his throat dry. It happened. Reed exhaled, a nervous laugh breaking through. That's not comforting. Daniels didn't respond. He turned slightly, glancing back through the rear window. The road behind them was empty. No figures. No shifting shadows. No sign that anything had ever been there. The town looked the same as it always had, quiet streets, dimly lit storefronts, a world still spinning as if nothing had changed. As if the two of them hadn't just driven out of something that should never have existed in the first place. Reed pulled into the station parking lot, killing the engine. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Daniels finally spoke. We need to report this. Reed let out a dry laugh. Report what? That we saw something impossible? That we were lifted off the ground by an invisible force? That a cat, of all things, led us into something we weren't supposed to see? Daniels didn't know how to answer. Reed sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. Look, I don't know what happened back there. I don't even know if I want to know. But I do know one thing, we got out. And I don't think we were supposed to. Daniels frowned. What do you mean? Reed turned, meeting his eyes. They let us go, Daniels. His voice was steady now, firm. That thing, whatever was coming for us, it didn't stop because we outran it. It stopped because it chose to. A cold chill ran down Daniel's spine. He didn't want to believe it, but deep down, he knew Reed was right. They had been allowed to leave. Daniels looked toward the station. The warm glow of the building felt distant, unreal. He knew that if they walked inside, everything would seem normal. The world would keep turning, but something had changed. He didn't know what the figures in the fog had been. He didn't know what had been waiting behind them, and he didn't know why they had been spared. But one thing was certain, they hadn't been the first to see it, and they wouldn't be the last.